It was here in the mills, the quarries, the mines, the small workshops and the farms. Industry was the glue that held communities together. And when that glue was stripped away, everything began to change. This is a story about what survived, what was lost, and what it left behind. I didn't live here, but I worked here. From Chatsworth to Bakewell, from industry to tourism. Over 6 decades of change in the Peak District. My first visit to the Peak District was to Chatsworth in 1967, the 18th year of its post-war opening to the public as a day trip attraction. I had a Kodak Instamatic 25 and these were the 3 photos that came out. I was 12 years old. I didn't know then that I was witnessing a region on the edge of transformation. Chatsworth endured, but the world around it would change dramatically over the next 6 decades. This video follows the journey from Chatsworth's Foresight to Bakewell's Scramble and finally to Roseley and the Peak Village. Along the way we will see how planning, opportunity and timing shaped who thrived and who struggled. It's a story of industry, collapse, reinvention and ultimately inequality. A story played out over 60 years. We set off from one of Chatsworth's major assets, its farm shop, converted from a stud farm to a cowshed and then converted to a farm shop in 1977. The Duke and Duchess of Devonshire seemingly not put off by the smokescreen enveloping the rest of the country. The Peak District wasn't just picturesque countryside. Calcite mines, quarries, dye works, paper mills and boot and shoe factories played their part in feeding Britain's national industry. Every farm, every workshop, every quarry was a vital link in the wider British industrial chain, therefore making us self-sufficient. For decades, 80% of production served our needs, 20% for export. A logical, resilient sequence until it was broken. The Peak District wasn't a separate part of the country, as it became to be seen, and probably still is. It was integrated and played an important economic role down both sides of the hills, but predominantly with Sheffield, Chesterfield, the South Yorkshire coalfields and beyond to places like Scunthorpe and Immingham, supplying the flux of steel making, limestone. But then came the disruption, or as Strauss and Howe call it, the awareness stage, the second stage in their generational theory. Remember this second stage, as you'll need it later. All I knew was that factories were closing, railways were being lifted, and therefore workers were relocating to the cities where the jobs were, or they hoped there'd be jobs. The Soviet defector Yuri Bezmenov called that process demoralisation, the slow loss of belief that anything solid could be rebuilt. Looking around now, I think he might have been onto something. Local economies struggled, the old 80-20 balance flipped, leaving communities dependent on global demand. Quarries and industrial sites often sat idle, waterlogged, sometimes toxic, instead of being repurposed. Resources were wasted, infrastructure lost, and no one seemed to stop and think. It was a spiral staircase descending one step at a time, invisible, until you reached the bottom. Back in the 90s, my job as a rep meant knocking on doors, often little workshops and factories, and trying to build trust. I worked with people of all kinds and mostly it felt natural. We were all just trying to make a living, and that gave us common ground. Today that would be impossible, because except for a few remaining farms, all my customers are gone and haven't been replaced. Meanwhile, Chatsworth followed the 3 R's: repair, reuse, refurbish, restoration. Careful reinvention and repurposing kept it resilient. The Peak Village expansion in Roseley is part of that long arc, a visitor-focused retail and leisure hub. It's expensive, geared to tourism and maybe not to the local population. Generally, balance sheets show stagnation and director churn. Even foresight has its limits when the tide is receding. But why? Strauss and Howe see it as a natural economic cycle straddling the average lifespan, that being 80 years, and being divided into 4 equal parts of 20 years at a time, or as near as, damn it. It starts with a high, moves to awareness, is followed by unravelling, and ends in crisis, before reverting to a high again, one hopes. That previous high having started in 1946, people my age reached their teenage years in the awareness stage between 1966 and 1986, and either became politicised or a pot-smoking hippie. But younger people, Gen Xers, would only be aware of things unravelling, and therefore Generation Z will have only been aware of the crisis stage, and will not have seen any better, and therefore will think it's always been like this, and that's what Yuri Bezmenov calls normalisation, imposing a new status quo, usually authoritarian, over an indefinite period. My own personal opinion is that Yuri Bezmenov's 4 stages of ideological subversion saw destabilisation and crisis happen between 1986 and 1996, bringing in normalisation with Blair and Brown in 1997, and very little has changed since, except for further crisis every 10 or so years, the economic crisis in 2008, COVID-19 in 2020, watch out for 2030. The Peak District was rich in lead. Romans discovered it, and centuries of bowl hills mark the landscape with the legacy of smelting. Lead has been outlawed as such a terrible substance, but with nearby sources enabled the DP Battery Company to set up in Lumford Mill at Bakewell. But the 70s saw it go west to chloride in Manchester, eventually becoming Exide, part of a global corporation. Bakewell's cattle market was the town side of the river. On Mondays it was part of the community. That was a long time ago in the 90s. It's now elite housing, wine bars and coffee shops. You wouldn't want a cow chute trailing in there, would you? Bakewell lost out twice. First cotton, then batteries. Most of the land remained in Devonshire's hands, but the industry and past livelihoods were gone. The Peak District, along with the flatlands that flanked it, had nearly everything Britain needed to be self-sufficient: iron, limestone, quartz, coal, calcite, lead, even sodium. Think about it. Coal plus quartz makes silicon. So Britain could have made its own chips rather than just designing them. Less pure silicon could have made solar panels. Just think of the diverse employment opportunities that would have brought. Add that to what was already known, that coal plus limestone plus iron ore made steel. A byproduct of that is sulphur, and sulphur is used to make sulphuric acid. Add lead and you've got lead acid batteries, and all the materials right next door to each other. But now we've moved to EVs. We don't have lithium, but there's plenty of sodium to the west of the Peak District. The hard carbon used in modern sodium-ion batteries could have been made using the same pyrolysis techniques as coking coal, but instead we simply levelled those sites. The knowledge, furnaces and workforce were there. With foresight, Britain could have stayed at the cutting edge. Instead, industry slipped away, factories closed. The railways that would have been the key linking it all together were lifted. The quarries were instead used for basic aggregates and cement, and then mostly abandoned. Yes, there are quarries left, but the local plan isn't inspiring. Why bother digging for a piece of the jigsaw when all the other pieces have been lost? Skills and infrastructure dispersed. Today we import far too much stuff that could have been made on our own soil. The chain of production, once strong, was irreparably broken. Tourism temporarily replaced industry, funneling money upward from the poorest, then from the middle classes, and eventually to a point where even the wider middle class cannot sustain it. Inequality hollows out the base. COVID gave a brief surge, a tide of spending, but it was temporary. The Peak District's visitor economy, like the spiral staircase, reaches a limit, and when it does, the system falters. I mean, how many times do you need a tour around Chatsworth House? Once you've seen it, you've seen it. Across Britain, productivity thrives when people can work within their means. Small workshops, independent trades, local enterprise, they are the lifeblood of communities. But when regulation, rent and planning rules put the start line out of reach, that lifeblood is cut off. I've seen it personally. Encouraged to aspire, yet denied the means to compete. In the Peak District, the story is written in stone and river. Industries cleared, workshops gone, communities dispersed, replaced by curated landscapes of heritage and tourism. Beauty, progress, fairness, the words are generous. The reality? Initiative erased, real enterprise stifled, and what could have flourished turned into loss. What comes next? 60 years of observation shows a clear pattern. Foresight preserves, short-term thinking destroys, and slow declines often go unnoticed until it's too late. Chatsworth endured because it thought ahead. Bakewell and the towns around it adapted, struggled, and sometimes failed. The Peak District, once plugged into Britain's industrial heart, now tells a story of continuity, disruption, and what we choose to value. The lessons are clear, if only we'd stop to see them.